Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. We're going to have a discussion, and then we're going to open it up to Q&A after about 30 minutes. As you probably know or may not know, this is being filmed by C-SPAN. So thank you very much, C-SPAN. And also, please ask a lot of questions and be as provocative as you want to be so that we can have a lot of very interesting conversations, and that will be great for television. So my name is Genevieve Abdo. I'm a senior fellow at the Hariri Center, and with us today, we're very honored to have Joyce Karam, who is the Washington correspondent for El Hayat, and who is really one of the most insightful journalists, I think, writing today for any media, particularly for the Middle East media. And I think that she has a very interesting and very truthful take on all sorts of issues in the region, but also what happens in Washington. And she was, if you read any of her coverage about the Iran nuclear deal, I always read it because it was absolutely spot on.
Thank you.
And so we're very honored today to have her with us. And so we're going to begin, and they're going to start taping, I guess. So thank you for coming.
Well, thank you, everyone. Good to be here. And I have to say, reading Genevieve's book, over the weekend, being interjected with a terror attack in Turkey, another attack in Egypt, ISIS taking Palmyra, it really brought it full circle. I think most of you have been in Washington, follow the event in the Middle East. But I rarely find a sense of realism and a real touch from the region that Genevieve brings into this book. I think what I liked about it is it just paints a very good big picture of what's happening in the Middle East. There is no nonsense. There is no wishy-washy talk about the future of the liberal democracies in the region. You don't get this. You really get what's happening in the region right now, a complex understanding of the dynamics I'm shocked they're always missing in the conversation in Washington. How many of us have heard about Salafism in the last year in the debate in Washington? Not many, and it is a major part of what's going on. I mean, it took Genevieve 4 years to research and write this book. Reading it, I saw, I grew up in near Tripoli, Lebanon, and she actually went there. She went to Arsal, she went to Baghdad, she went to Kuwait, she went to Bahrain, and that's where I think this book is different. It's also, refreshingly very honest and candid over realities in the region that we try to spin, we try to censor here in DC. It tells you who is paying who, which cleric is sitting in Baghdad or Tripoli and spreading hateful rhetoric on Twitter. This is a debate that definitely we need to happen in the region, and I think to understand the post-Arab Spring Middle East, this is a truly must-read. Congratulations on a really phenomenal book. And I will only take 30 minutes, then we will go to you for questions. But I will start, Genevieve, by asking you, at which point watching the Arab Spring you said to yourself, this is not Eastern Europe. This is actually not the myth that we all believed in here in Washington, D.C., and in places like Syria, for example, where it is an open inferno now. Do you think if the regime had acted differently in the beginning, or if the opposition didn't get arms, things could have been different and we wouldn't be at this sectarian upheaval we're seeing today?
In Syria?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mean, I think that you raise a broader issue, which is really important, and that is that, you know, a lot of the discussions in the beginning, of course, everyone was very optimistic. And you use the diplomatic term that my book is honest, but a lot of people always say that I'm too cynical and that, you know, every time I give a lecture about the Middle East, everyone says, oh no, now we're going to kill ourselves. But because I generally am pessimistic about the region, but I think that it's more of sort of a realism. And so when the Arab uprising started, I think that, you know, there was far too much optimism about the outcome, and given all the different factions, whether they're religious, political, I mean, it was obvious that this was going to take generations to sort out in the beginning. And I think in the case of Syria, it like most uprisings, and what's important, I think, is to talk about the similarities. Because if you look at Bahrain, if you look at Syria, if you look at Egypt, the uprising started all with the same goal, which was to oust dictators. Right. In Bahrain, it wasn't necessarily regime change. It was to create a constitutional monarchy, which is something different. But nonetheless, it was to improve the current form of governance. And so they all began that way. But unfortunately, after a short, you know, bit of time, all the uprisings sort of deteriorated into, you know, conflicts about religion, conflicts about politics, conflicts among Sunnis, you know, extremists versus more, hate to use the word moderate, but within the Sunni tradition, you know, how Islam was going to be practiced. And I think that the moment for me when I knew this was going to be something significant and different and violent was when I was in Egypt right after President Morsi had been elected. And I was interviewing a Salafist in Cairo, and he said to me, our goal has nothing to do with changing the Egyptian government. We're glad the Muslim Brotherhood is in power, but our objective is to redefine how Islam is practiced.
Right, and that actually also comes out very vividly and very strongly in the book, how different the Salafists are playing the game here. I mean, given what's happening in Egypt particularly, do you see them being the more dominant sort of, you know, quote unquote Islamist force in the future? And are we, I mean, as Arabs, are we predestined to this cycle between authoritarianism and sectarianism?
I think that in terms of the Salafists, it really depends on what country we're talking about, because the Salafists in Egypt, yes. I mean, obviously, they, for the most part, and this is generally speaking, and I don't want to simplify it too much, but they went from being sort of part of what we call in Arabic a dawah movement into being politicized because there was an opportunity. So when the collapse happened, when Mubarak was ousted from power, they became much more politically active than they had been. They ran for seats in parliament. So, and that was something that hadn't happened on that scale before. I think now, I'm actually going to Egypt tomorrow to interview Salafists, but I think so. I could probably answer this more effectively in a week from now. But in any case, I think that what happened after the Arab uprisings is that it empowered them in some cases. Some of the Salafists were co-opted by the government. And I think that more or less that's still the case.
Do you see them ever going mainstream given how literal their interpretation is?
No, I don't think so. And I think that there are enough openings within religious interpretation. And, you know, there's a term now that's always used, the democratization of religion, which basically means that there's a lot of competition now for the religious message. There are Salafists, there are extremists, and they're part of this discussion. And there's an opening for different interpretations. So I don't see that they are retreating. I think if anything, they'll become more prominent.
You also talk a lot about, you know, post-Saddam Iraq, Iran's role, the past resentment we had from Arab Shia towards Iran, and how the rise of ISIS has really changed this dynamic. You followed Iran also for a long time. I mean, is Iran first winning today? do the paradigms of Iran and ISIS mutually benefit from each other in a place like Iraq? And what's the future of the Iraqi state looks like?
Well, I think, Joyce, you've written a lot about this as well, Iran's role in the region, and we're probably on the same page on these issues. But it's clear when I did go to Najaf, and the first chapter of the book is about the clerical establishment in Najaf, it is clear that they have a few objectives. One is they want to distinguish themselves from Persian Shia. So they feel that what's happened as Iran has become much more powerful in the Arab world is that people equate Persian Shiism with Arab Shiism. So that's very important to them that a distinction is made. And I think another thing that's very important to them is that they feel that the Iraqi government has been co-opted by the Iranians, and they don't know what to do about it.
Are they right?
It seems so. I mean, co-opted is too strong a word, but clearly, if you have Revolutionary Guards in the country, if you have, all sorts of, the Al-Quds forces, Iran's presence militarily, they have religious influence in the country, which began not from the Arab uprisings, but since the U.S. invasion. Then, of course, Iran has a great role to play now in Iraq. And I think that for a lot of the Arab Shia, that's not okay. And so, and on the Sunni side, some of the tribal leaders who were interviewed in the book, they basically told me that, and I met them in Erbil, not in Iraq, but they basically told me that they supported the takeover of Mosul because they thought that given the choice between an Iranian-backed Shia-led government that was marginalizing the Sunnis and ISIS, they'd rather cast their lot with ISIS. And that was quite shocking to me, but that's what they told me.
But then, we see ourselves going through the same circle. I mean, before it was ISIS, it was Al-Qaeda in Iraq. Now we're into Fallujah has been occupied and liberated 3 times. ISIS retook Palmyra again just yesterday after it was liberated by the Assad and Russia forces in March. It seems just, I don't know if it's just us or nobody wants to see the missing piece here or address it. Are we gonna go through the same cycle as long as this sectarian question, as long as these sectarian problems are not honestly dealt with?
Unfortunately, I think so, because even if you dealt with, say, and Al-Qaeda supposedly is on the rise in certain countries now, but even if you dealt with the problem of extremism, I mean, it in a military sense, and this is, I guess, the other reason I wrote the book is that, in Washington, I think all of these issues are sort of addressed through, there has to be some military solution. But in fact, I think what we've learned over the last 20 years is that all these Islamist movements, whether they're extremist or not, they're evolving in ways that we can't control and certainly cannot be controlled or affected by a military solution. And because there's rivalry, I think it's important to explain that even though my book is about the Shia-Sunni struggle, there's also a Sunni-Sunni struggle and a Shia-Shia struggle. So all of this complexity and these conflicts that are being played out on the ground are sort of an invitation for extremists because then they can capitalize on one group versus another. Yeah. And, and as I mentioned, even groups that, why would Sunni tribal leaders support ISIS? Well, ISIS was able at that moment in time to capitalize on the marginalization they were feeling from the Iraqi government. And so there was an opening.
And back to Iran's role in this. I mean, I remember, in Lebanon when Hezbollah was just a small group in the early 80s, orchestrating terror attacks, but not really claiming them. And here we are at a point where Hezbollah is actually now publicly says it's involved in Syria, in Yemen, in to a lesser extent in Bahrain and in Iraq. What does it say about the Iranian policy in the region? And has actually the Hezbollah model succeeded so that they could replicate it in other places?
Well, that's a really important question, because as part of this divide that's escalating between the Shia and Sunni, what's interesting is that, if you look at Nasrallah's speeches from, say, the beginning of the Arab uprisings, he didn't play the so-called Shia card, okay, and neither did Iran. Khamenei was talking about an Islamic awakening. He was talking about pan-Islamism, that this was going to be, these were Arab uprisings to fight colonialism, imperialism. But as of 2014, when Nasrallah made this big speech, I think it was in July, he basically said, Hezbollah now is a Shia militia. I mean, and the Iranians, and that's, I'm simplifying it, but that was his message when he acknowledged that they had boots on the ground in Syria after, of course, everyone, there was overwhelming evidence that that was the case. But Iran has done the same thing, basically. Because of their military activity in Arab countries that you mentioned, they can no longer talk about pan-Islamism. They can no longer talk about being a state that represents all Muslims against the West. And so this, I think, and this is what I talk about in the book, the reason that these speeches are important and the reason that these developments are important from leaders, whether it's Hezbollah or Khamenei, is the way it's perceived on the ground.
Yeah.
Because as you know, well, Arab societies now are in a state of anxiety.
Completely. I mean, I was in Morocco last summer, and just average people you talk to there, and they'd be, we don't like the king much, but we don't want to be Syria. Right. And I think the trauma effect that the war in Syria had over the region, and not just Syria. I mean, you look at Libya as well. It is a step back for the efforts of democratization and liberalization in the region. But I mean, on Iran specifically, it's I think a fascinating experiment to watch. That coming from Lebanon again, that Hezbollah would be actually now is an occupying force, for example, in Syria. That the Hashd al-Sha'bi in Iraq, despite all what we hear in Washington, no, it's not a quote unquote pure resistance force against ISIS. And I don't know how we actually can get out of this now, because this has become the new status quo. And the argument you hear repeatedly in DC on governance, on human rights, but how does this remotely resonate with what's going on the ground in areas of conflict? I mean, do you see any hope for a push for better governance in the region anytime soon?
Again, I think it depends on the country. I mean, I think that in Bahrain, probably not, because the mainstream Shia movement, al-Wafaq, has been completely isolated from the political process. In Egypt, there's a very repressive government that now is in power that's also not very inclusive politically. If you sort of go down the list, it doesn't seem very optimistic. In Lebanon, I always think of Lebanon sort of in a different category, and maybe you disagree because you spent so much of your life there. But I sort of look at Lebanon as in a post-sectarian era, in the sense that despite the fact that, that there are religious factions, all sorts of different political interest groups, somehow the Lebanese, I guess maybe having fought 15 years of civil war, there's a social contract now in Lebanon where, Hezbollah is very important in the government. But people have decided, okay, basically this is a fait accompli, can't do really that much about it. Let's not kill each other over it.
And the Syria effect.
And the Syria effect,
Again.
right. That's, as you mentioned, that's really terrifying people because nobody wants to become another Syria. And
how much the proxy war in the region, contributed to where we are today. I mean, you look at Libya, for example. There is a proxy war happening between, the Sunni aspect you're talking about. It's a regional Sunni proxy war within Libya. You look at Iraq as well. There is a proxy war over there. So how do you address this? Do the populations of Libya or Iraq or even Lebanon and Syria, do they have any willpower at this point to break out of this proxy war that the region has fumed and benefited from for a while now?
I think it's difficult, and I just want to mention that as we're talking about this, we don't want to give the impression that all of Arab societies are sort of engulfed or engaged in these conflicts because most people actually feel victimized by the conflicts and they feel helpless. Mm-hmm. And that's why I think, as I mentioned, people feel a lot of anxiety. But what's happened, to your point about proxy wars, is that, so you have these states, whether it's Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Iran, jockeying for power on a geopolitical level. And that affects societies. And some factions react to it. Some factions try to take advantage of the situation of the proxy war, but then others are just completely innocent victims. And that's probably the majority of mm-hmm. Arab societies now, is that they have to live in these conflicts, whether they're driven by states, whether they're driven by extremist groups, and they feel very helpless that they can't control the future. They can't even control whether they get a job or not. Forget about the future, or forget about their political future.
And in a place like Syria, the actual activists that started the uprising right. are either kidnapped, like Razan Zaitouni now. Father Paulo has disappeared. You have many are now in exile. And the new dynamic we're approaching in Syria is between after the soon fall of Aleppo is increasingly becoming between Assad and ISIS on the one hand, and then Al-Qaeda affiliated Nusra. I mean, they changed their name now. But do you see this dictating the new narrative in areas of conflict where the two extremes will take over if these conflicts are not addressed?
I think that's the case. And if you look at, in the old days in Egypt before the Arab uprising started, if you remember, former President Mubarak used to always say, you have to support my government because I'm the only alternative to the Muslim Brotherhood, which he painted as an extremist group, which is not an extremist group. And so that was always the choice. And I think that narrative continues. Mm-hmm. It just became more complicated because, as you say, there are more players now. But Assad played the same narrative in the beginning of the uprising, right? Mm-hmm. He said, extremists are going to take over Syria, so you have to support me against the uprising because the alternative is worse.
Yeah.
And so I think that the basic narrative has not changed, unfortunately, and we have seen a pattern and we've seen the direction it's taken. The only difference now is that there are a lot of different players than they were before on both of these extremist sides.
Mm-hmm. And I also enjoyed the chapter on Bahrain, how you went there, how you describe it. Two questions here. Had Saudi, GCC not intervened, what would the situation be like at the moment? How real is the Iranian role in Bahrain? And we don't hear about Bahrain anymore.
No,
But
it's
what's
true.
at stake if the current status quo continues?
Well, I think that Bahrain, even though it's a minor sort of unstable state in the scheme of things, which is why I guess, during President Obama's administration, there wasn't that much focus on the situation of Bahrain. But I think if you look at the developments that happened there, they very much mirror the developments in other countries as it regards the Shia-Sunni issue. And for example, as you mentioned, when the Saudis invaded, when the uprising began as a Shia and Sunni-led uprising. There were Sunnis involved in the uprising because they wanted to create a constitutional monarchy in Bahrain. But when the Saudis invaded, 3 months, 4 months into the uprising, it was about 3 or 4 months into the uprising, it allowed the government to completely change the message and the narrative. So then it became Sunni Saudi Arabia and the Sunni-led Bahraini government against the Shia. And that extended to Iran as well. So then the government began this propaganda campaign on television, in the newspapers, which are run state-owned, that this was an Iranian plot that the Shia in Bahrain were part of to overthrow the government.
Yeah.
And where the Saudi invasion came in, and as you point out, is that it helped the government advance this narrative.
It's almost, these self-fulfilling prophecies that we see repeat themselves in the region. But, another aspect that's just, as a journalist, it is close to heart when you start talking about Twitter, the level of hate across the board. I mean, these people just really don't like the extremist narrative that we see on Twitter from opposing sides. I mean, just last week after the fall of Aleppo, you saw the pro-Hezbollah rhetoric was extremely sectarian on Twitter. There was this video of a Hezbollah journalist going with the flag and climbing up to the citadel of Aleppo, and essentially, declaring victory. Just yesterday, after the bombing in Egypt, you saw people celebrating the killing of Christians, and these are mostly tweets in Arabic that, maybe we don't get translated much here in Washington, but you talk in length about this, about the role of the social media in fueling the sectarian war. And what worries me is that we don't have the tools or the oversight to address it. I mean, how big is this problem? And your direct engagement with clerics that fuel this hate speech, what did it teach you?
Well, I think it's a huge problem, and because a lot of this is being articulated in Arabic, it's difficult for people in the U.S. to understand the magnitude.
Right.
So, and the reason I went to Twitter is that I was everyone always asked, well, how do you know that this, anti-Shia sentiment exists? How can you prove it, right? So I thought, well, okay, Twitter seems like a good way to try to figure out the anti-Shia sentiment. And as you saw, I mean, the tweets are so graphic, that they're going to grind the flesh of the Shia. And I mean, the things that are said are just horrific. But to your point about, is it important? I think it's hugely important. Because if you look, I mean, some of the people I profile in this book have 14 million Twitter followers. So even though in terms of methodology, and I'm about the last person to be analyzing the technicalities of social media, but I looked at it more from a substantive point of view. And even if you can't scientifically evaluate the penetration of these messages, okay, who's following them? How does that affect what happens on the ground? I attempted to do that, you can't really decide, okay, someone's tweeting about the Battle of Qusair. How did that affect what happened on the ground? I mean, it's difficult to know, But if someone has 14 million Twitter followers, you have to assume that somebody is absorbing this material. And so I think, and it is, and it's massive. I mean, you know, if you have millions of followers, and I think the other thing that's dangerous about it is that it's reinforced by different forms of media, right?
Not the mainstream media, but,
No,
but
right.
it does
Yeah.
marginalize, you know, people like me, like, you know, even Al Jazeera, Al Arabiya, and others. We're trying. I mean, speaking of fake news here, everyone is throwing a fit. I mean, we've had it in the Arab world for a long time now, and I don't know how you address it. I mean, when you tell these clerics, when you tell these extremists, when you read them these tweets, what's the...
Well, what I was, as we were talking about this earlier today, but what I thought was interesting. So, I didn't really have access to the Saudis, so I just followed them on Twitter. But I did have access to Salafists in other countries, so I went to northern Lebanon, to the Tripoli area, where they all are, and I started reading back to them their tweets that they had tweeted in Arabic, and at least 3 Salafists said, I didn't tweet that, somebody else did. And so what's interesting, and you know, we can, in another conversation, get into the sort of the power of the internet and social media, but because I think it encourages people to be more aggressive than they would be normally.
Yeah.
And to create more hostility. But they were trying to convince me that they didn't tweet that. And so, you know, and then finally, it was one particular Salafist who I said, okay, so if you didn't tweet this, just answer a question. Do you think the Shia are real Muslims? And he said no. So, you know, if you sort of, I think that the danger of Twitter, in addition to a lot of other dangers, is that it gives people the license to be much more aggressive. And if they had to confront to strangers like me or to anybody else outside of their communities what they were really saying, they want to retract it. Mm-hmm. But once it's out there,
well,
you know.
I'm glad you're out of that meeting safe and sound. But, you know, one last question. We do have a new administration coming to town. What we heard, you know, what we both heard from President-elect Trump so far on the Middle East, do you think there is anything different here? You know, what I've read over, for example, his statement after meeting Sisi, there is no mention of human rights or any form of oppression in Egypt. There is a laser focus on counterterrorism, it seems. And there is an interest in pushing Iran back in the region, or at least that's what we understand from the few nominations he has made. Is that still realistic today, given, as you say in this book here, how much influence Iran has had today in Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and even in new places like Yemen? So what do you expect from the Trump administration? And looking at the region, what do you see it looking like maybe in 4 years?
Well, I think it's dangerous for anyone to try to predict anything about the Trump administration. But having said that, it does seem that there will be some attempt to deal with Iran in a different way, of course, than President Obama did. But I just don't know how effective that will be. I mean, I think that short of having a direct effect on the hardliners in Iran and the Revolutionary Guards, which is impossible, right? And I think that what people don't understand about Iran is that there are many Iranian states. I mean, there's the state of the foreign ministry and the presidency. There's the state of the hardliners and the Revolutionary Guards, which is part of the military apparatus. And so you're dealing with many different states. Mm-hmm. And this is why the nuclear negotiations, which were with the presidency and the foreign ministry, of course approved by Khamenei, but that process does not have an effect on what Iran does on the ground in all the countries you mentioned. There's no connection between these two things necessarily, except that the nuclear deal has provided Iran with cash reserves, ability to sell its oil that presumably could aid their military apparatus in all these countries. But I think that if the Trump administration does try to do something to try to minimize Iran's influence in the region, that's a good thing. I just don't know if it's possible.
I mean, the dynamics of the conflicts, especially in Iraq. I mean, I don't know. I ask myself this question: how are you gonna counter Iran when you're actually providing Air Force support for groups that are funded by Iran? I mean, I don't know. Is it me, or does it seem little?
No. And that's part of all the complexities. I mean, obviously, the United States has basically endorsed two Shia-led governments in Iraq that are working closely with Iran. So that's sort of one situation. But then in Syria, the United States is, against Assad's government, which is supported by Iran. So, and that's why the nuclear negotiations were a very complicated process. And some people in the administration even said, and I don't know if this is true or not because I've never worked in government, but that one of the reasons the United States never attacked Syria at a crucial time was because the Obama administration didn't want to disrupt the negotiations on the nuclear deal.
In
So
2013, In 2013, with the red line.
Right. So these competing forces and interests make, obviously, U.S. policy in the region very complicated and very conflicting.
But you don't see this sectarian war, this sectarian gap, healing itself in
Unfortunately,
4 years.
I don't think so.
Well, on that not so optimistic note, we'll turn it over to questions from the audience. So I think someone will bring the mic. Let's start over here. Yeah, and please identify yourself. And we're actually, I should have mentioned this half an hour ago. The hashtag is New Sectarianism on Twitter, if you're tweeting.
Okay, so my name is Mohammed. I'm with the Atlantic Council. Thank you so much for the interesting conversation and for this interesting book. I'm looking forward to read it. My question actually is about the title of this book. You mentioned New Sectarianism and the repairs of Shia-Sunni divide. Because for me, sectarian politics and the Shia-Sunni divide has been always there, has been always like a driving factor for the politics, not only between the different countries within the region, but even with a lot of local communities. So what is new about this sectarianism? What is new about like this Sunni-Shia divide given the situation after the Arab Spring? Thank you.
Thank you.
I think that what's new is, well, first of all, the point I mentioned earlier, which is that there are many more competing messengers and interpreters of how Islam should be practiced, which has increased the violence. So, in the 90s, for example, when I wrote a book about the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, if you wanted to know what was being said at the mosque, you went to the mosque and you stood outside the mosque to listen to the Friday prayer. And basically, even though the sermons in the mosque certainly were not uniformed, there were certain trends within the religious community of the message that was being conveyed. There were more radical sheikhs than others. There were sort of self-appointed sheikhs, as you know, Mohammed, because you're from Egypt. If you go to neighborhoods in Egypt, anybody is a sheikh. I mean, he doesn't have to have a, and it's not just Egypt. I don't want to isolate Egypt, but I'm just saying. So I call them freelance sheikhs, right? So that phenomenon really started in the 80s and 90s. But what's happened is if you can magnify that like 1,000 times, okay? So that to me is what's changed, that there are many messengers, many interpreters of how Islam should be practiced. And although this is a very controversial point, one could argue that ISIS is promoting a certain practice of the faith that 99% of Muslims don't agree with. But the point is that they do use the texts to refer to hadith to refer to the Quran to justify their actions. I mean, it's Baghdadi who says Islam is a religion of the sword. Most Muslims, of course, overwhelmingly, of course, don't subscribe to this belief. But so there are many competing messages and messengers, and I think that that's what's changed, and that's what has escalated the whole divide and created more violence. Because, and the other thing I think to keep in mind, and I didn't mention this before, but in the old days, if you want to look at Egypt in the 90s as an example, there was much more control of the religious message by state-sponsored religious institutions. And the Egyptians started losing control of the message in the 70s, but even in the 90s, there was a lot more state control over what was said from the pulpit, what was said on the street. That is evaporated. I mean, the state has a lot less control, with the exception of a country like Morocco, from what is being, I guess, projected to be Islamic practice.
And it does seem, I mean, having grown up in the Lebanese Civil War, for example, that every kind of limitation we had is off now. I mean, and that's the new level of brutality in the attacks, whether, in suicide bombings or what we saw at the cathedral yesterday is just, there is nothing almost haram anymore in that sense. So
it's a free-for-all. I mean, I think that's what's changed.
Gonna go here, then we're gonna go here.
Thank you. I'm Rafi Danziger, an advisor to AIPAC. If I may, two quick questions. Number one, some people say that the Iranian-backed Shiite militias are just as cruel as ISIS, except they don't put it on YouTube. So do you agree with that? And if yes, is there evidence? And number two, it seems that so far the only Arab country that actually seems to move into a democracy is Tunisia, where it all started. Do you think it's sustainable in Tunisia? Thank you.
I'm glad you raised the points about the point about the Shia militias. I write somewhat extensively in the book in the first chapter that's placed in Najaf on the Shia militias. I do think they're very, very violent, and I've watched a lot of videos of, for example, when they went into Tikrit and other parts of Iraq, where they burn people, hang people from lampposts. I saw people being executed at gunpoint, Sunnis. And what's more important, getting back to sort of the question that Mohammed raised, is that some of these militias were created by a fatwa that Ayatollah Sistani issued, calling upon Shia and Sunni, not just Shia, but if you read the Arabic, Sunni and Shia, to rise up against ISIS. And some of these militias were formed as a result of this fatwa. So this is a cleric issuing a religious decree to try to combat extremism. But what happened is that once he encouraged people and called them to arms, he couldn't control what happened later. So they no longer listen to Sistani. Now they're listening to I'm simplifying it, but to some degree, now their commanders are the Iranian Revolutionary Guards, not Sistani. So I think that that's a good example of not being able to control the message, that once you unleash something, you don't know what the consequence is going to be. And yes, they are very violent. And I have every reason to believe that the videos I've seen were legitimate. I mean, I checked with people. They were given to me by legitimate sources, and they're on the internet. I mean, they're not just given to me, but some of these videos are on the internet. About Tunisia, I'm not an expert on Tunisia or North Africa. I do think that what's happened there, just generally speaking, is very positive. And but when we look at the success stories, you have to place them in the context of the region. So one of the reasons that Tunisia, I think, has been more successful than in terms of the role of the Islamist movement than Egypt is that they compromised with the government. Mm-hmm. So they knew when to participate in politics, when not to participate in politics. It wasn't an all or nothing proposition. That wasn't the case in Egypt. The government decided, I think incorrectly, that they were going to oust a democratically elected government, which was the Muslim Brotherhood, and create a military dictatorship. And so I don't think that gives us hope for a success story in Egypt compared to Tunisia, where there was much more of a democratic process.
And was it also, I mean, because of the soft transition that happened, but how much did the education programs that the Tunisian government invested in the country also helped in this? I mean,
right. No, and well, the educational system, as far as I know, has always been much more, I guess, or shall we say, less polarizing than the Egyptian educational system, in terms of Middle East history, in terms of how Islam is sort of taught and portrayed. So, you're talking about a completely different context. And I think that that's why the outcome is different, in addition to a lot of other reasons. But I'm certainly not a Tunisian expert, so I'm just sort of giving you my general impressions.
and yet we do see that the highest number of jihadists, or used to be the highest number
of jihadists
flowing to Syria, were coming from Tunis. But that's also, I mean, there were good signs, but the element of radicalization that was also happening underground in Tunis, it does exist, funded by the outside, through schools, through other aspects. You do talk about in this book, in other models, but did exist in Tunis, but not to the level that I think, produced Syria or Iraq. Yeah. So we're gonna go.
Yes. Thank you. Philip Sedlank, and I'm, I guess, a health communicator. I have a question about the East African littoral, and let's skip the area from, say, Djibouti to the Kenya border and go from Kenya all the way down to Lamu, Mombasa, the Tanzanian coast, Dar es Salaam, Zanzibar, and the western part of Madagascar. Do you have, and I know the area fairly well, and I know that when I was there were Sunnis, there were Shias, this was in the 70s, they were all living in peace, but the ethnic origins of these people, there were Boras, there were Baluchis, there were Sunnis, and there were Shias from Yemen, there were Omanis, and it was very mixed. And it's an area of considerable friction on the East African coast. I wonder if you have any ideas about what's going to happen there. Thanks.
No, I can't speak to that because I don't research that part of the world. But the only thing I will say that's somewhat related to your question is if you're interested in polling on these issues in other parts of the world, in Africa, how the Shia view the Sunnis and vice versa, the Pew Forum has done excellent polling on these issues, and the geographic the geographic span of their polling is huge, and they did poll in parts of Africa. And what they found, which I found to be really fascinating, as it regards Africa, is they do the polling over time, and they ask the same questions, obviously, because you want to have consistency. But what they found is that as the Saudis developed more of a presence in parts of Africa, okay, before the Saudis had any real presence in Africa, when they polled Sunnis and they asked them, what are your views of the Shia, they didn't know what a Shia was. But as the Saudis became more influential in some African countries, when they polled later, they got a much more negative response from the Sunnis toward the Shia. So again, this speaks to sort of the perceptions on the ground of state-driven sectarian kind of discourse. But anyway, I thought that was interesting. But I'm sorry, I can't speak specifically about Africa because I don't research that part of the world.
And for the first time last year, actually, the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Nasrallah, in his speech, talked about Nigeria. He was messaging, actually paying condolences to a Shia cleric that died there. So it will be very interesting to watch what Genevieve talked about, and a more vocal Hezbollah effort, role, whatever you want to call it, in the continent. Gonna go here.
Thank you. Thank you for the wonderful conversation. Mohammed Al-Shwaiter, a Fulbright Fellow from Yemen. I have two questions. First of all, I mean, you mentioned the new sectarianism, and it's like what Fukuyama mentioned, that the Shia-Sunni conflict, it erupted just recently, if you agree with that or not. So what's make that this new sectarianism more, I mean, aggressive? Who is using who? Politicians been used by sectarianism or clerics, or they are playing, I mean, or vice versa. So who's using who? A second question, if you have, playing this with the conflict in Yemen, how is that linked as a sectarian conflict? Thank you.
Do you want to answer? No. Okay. Well, I think, again, Yemen is a perfect example of an opportunity. Okay, so in the beginning, as you know better than me, the Houthis weren't necessarily backed by Iran, right? But as time went on and as the war developed and deteriorated, there was an opportunity for Iran to become involved. And there was an opportunity for the Houthis to capitalize on Iran's willingness to become involved. And so, I think that sort of goes back to what we were talking about Iran. I mean, I think that in this town in particular, people have a tendency to view Iran as this aggressor state that is going to launch a nuclear war, that's going to invade this country or that country. And in fact, if you look at the history of modern Iran, their strategy is much more complicated. They're not an aggressor state necessarily. They're a state that capitalizes on opportunity. The same was true in Iraq in the beginning, if you look in the beginning. The same is true in Bahrain. Iran was not involved in the uprising that first occurred in 2011, but what's happened since then, and US intelligence reports have confirmed this, that some of the more radical youth groups that developed as a result of the Bahraini government are now either accepting directly or indirectly aid from Iran or Hezbollah. Some of them now are located in Lebanon. So to answer your question, I think that, a lot of these conflicts the way that they have ended up today isn't the way that they began. And I think Yemen is a perfect example of that.
About that. Since we're short on time, let's take...
Well, we have 10 minutes.
We have 10 minutes. Okay, yeah. So we're gonna take two questions at a time. So Rasha, actually, the gentleman here, then Rasha.
Yes, my name is Kambi Bhatt. I'm with the Pakistani Spectator. And do you see? I mean, these are a proxy war basically between Saudi Arabia and Iran, and they are fighting everywhere in the Muslim world. Do you see any compromising point for these two countries, given that Iran has been relatively stable because mullah have been there for almost more than 30 years. And Saudi Arabia is very stable in terms as long as American interests are there, Saudi regime is going to stay there. So what is that make them so insecure and keep getting the Shia-Sunni killed all over in Muslim world? Do you see any compromising point between these two nations that could help them to calm Muslim world? Thanks.
Then Rasha, yeah.
Thank you. My name is Rasha Ilas. I'm a journalist, and I spent a decade reporting in the Middle East, most recently in Syria. I'd like to speak to the point you mentioned, Genevieve, about different characters on the stage trying to interpret Islam and sort of a competition to own the narrative on Islam. And I've certainly seen that firsthand in Syria and throughout the region. But there's also the power of money and arms, certainly in Syria, and that's coming from one interpretation of Islam, or at least two, Saudi Arabia and Iran, and those are really the sources of the proxy wars in Syria and arguably the source of many conflicts throughout the region. My question is, what do you think the U.S. should do about this? I mean, is it sort of reminiscent of the U.S. aligning itself with Al-Qaeda back in the Cold War and then having it come back to bite us in the behind, or is it sort of no, let the two sides sort of fight each other out in a war of attrition? Who cares? Let's just be cynical as long as this doesn't spill over into the West.
Excellent questions. Yeah.
Tough questions. In terms of Saudi and Iran, the one common denominator is I don't think the United States can influence either country in terms of what it does in the region. And when the Arab uprisings began and the Saudis had just gone into Bahrain, at the time, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton was having small meetings with people who know something about the Arab world in her office. And I was in a meeting of maybe 7 to 10 people. And we asked her, well, what is the United States going to do about Saudi Arabia? They just went into Bahrain. And she said, there's nothing we can do about the Saudis. Next question. So I think that's sort of the case. And again, I've never been in government. I have no idea what the United States should or should not do. But I think that what we've learned since the Arab uprisings began is that the United States' role is limited. And the leverage is limited. I mean, what leverage does the United States have really over Iran in terms of preventing Revolutionary Guards, Al-Quds Force from operating in Syria, Lebanon, I just don't know what the leverage is. And what the Iranians did, and this is, again, somewhat of a controversial statement, but what the Iranians did throughout the nuclear negotiations is that they were very strategic to make sure that the negotiations were only about the nuclear issue. Okay, and the negotiations, they made clear that was one of the conditions from the beginning. It wasn't going to be about Syria. It wasn't going to be about Iraq. It was confined only to the nuclear issue, and that was very smart on their part. Now, the Rouhani people would say privately, and I was in some private meetings with Rouhani people, wink, wink, the next conversation is going to be about Syria. But I knew that would never happen because it's not in their interest. So the way that they tried to convince, I think, some Americans that if there was going to be a nuclear deal and all parties could agree on the conditions and the terms of the agreement, that then there would be some sort of negotiating process in which they would offer concessions on Syria. But of course, as we've seen, that hasn't happened.
Do you see, to the gentleman's question, any opportunity for a rapprochement between Saudi and Iran anytime soon?
I don't know. I mean, there would have to be interest by both sides, and I don't see what those interests could be, because they're both benefiting from the rivalry. And, so what benefit really is there in concessions?
To Rasha's question, covering the Syrian war from here, we did hear at the beginning from one U.S. defense official that perhaps there is a silver lining of Al-Qaeda and Hezbollah fighting in Syria. I mean, that was in 2013. I'd like to find the same official again and ask the same question, see how silver that lining still is. And we had one question over there.
Yes, I'm Kawa from Kurdistan 24 for Media and Research.
Can you bring the mic closer?
Yes. I'm Kawa from K24 for Media and Research. My question is about the role of the Kurds. By talking about all of the issues and the struggles between the religious parties and these countries and the influences of countries like Iran, Saudi, Turkey to Iraq, especially in Iraq. The Kurds played a good role in keeping the stability and the stabilized between the Shias and Sunnis in Iraq for years after the defeat of Saddam Hussein. I need my question, the Kurds, yes. My question is, how far do you believe that the Kurds, in spite of facing all of their own troubles, fights against ISIS and the economic crisis and all of that, they did that role in the right way? And what is the missing part of the Kurds on their role to keep that goes on in Iraq especially? Thank you.
I don't really think I can speak, you know, in an informed way about the Kurds. The only thing I will say is that, you know, in Iraq, I mean, basically the Kurds have a de facto state. I mean, that's pretty clear at this point, as part of, you know, as a result of everything that's happened in Iraq. And I think that the Kurds, if you look at the Iranian Kurds, I mean, the Kurds have been victims everywhere. And Iran is a perfect place where they have been victims. And so it's been very difficult for the Kurds, say, in Iran to fight for, you know, equal rights with the rest of the population. When Mohammed Khatami was president, the Kurds had a lot more power, and they were empowered by his administration. They were allowed, for example, to have their own languages in schools. He appointed Kurdish officials that headed Kurdish majority areas of Iran, which has been quite taboo. But I mean, I can't really speak to, you know, what their deficiencies are, if that's your question, because I'm not qualified to do that.
But do you see, I mean, the Kurds, they are Sunnis themselves. Right. Them avoiding getting sucked into the Sunni-Shia war, how did it?
Well, I think we've already seen that. I mean, you know, I mean, the Kurds, when Iran sort of came to the rescue of the Kurds, right, when ISIS was at the doorstep, I mean, you already saw this kind of strange alliance. Not alliance, that's putting too much of a point on it, but you already saw some sort of cooperation. And the Kurds were very thankful to the Iranians that they came to their rescue. And they were sort of asked, well, what about Sunni states? Why didn't they come to our rescue? And so, so that's where, you know, as I said, remember opportunity. You know, the Iranians offer opportunities, and unlikely bedfellows sometimes accept them.
Yep. Well, thank you so much, everyone. Enjoy the rest of the day, and please enjoy the rest of the day after buying a copy of Janim's book outside. It'll make a great read on the holidays.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you.